Mr. Speaker, we believe that some values within our society is not something that we put on debates. We believe that something that is debatable, we count as debatable, is something we have like values that we question about a lot. We question that is not set up by any kind of sanctity or kind of norms, right? However, Mr. Speaker, when it comes to cases of human rights, or when it comes to cases of discrimination, illegal and unfair discrimination of a minority, it's not never something that we should say that is absolute truth or absolute well or absolute good, nor should we put it as some kind of a debatable format. So before I go on to anything, what do you mean by criminalizing glorification? I'm going to talk about what do you mean by criminalization or glorification. This debate is not about how and how should be penalized, what kind of punishment should there be. It's whether or not the government itself or the nation should actively condemn or put an active condemnation on these speeches that actually glorify dictatorship. So secondly, what is glorification? Before I talk about glorification that happened in two levels of analysis, I'm going to basically tell you what glorification is. Glorification passes a sphere of debate, right? Basically, people who glorify certain actions means that they don't think this is debatable. They just believe this is an absolute truth or absolute well done job, which is something that we should not put on debate. Look at the glorification is something like, oh, he did a good job. It is something that we do not debate about. It is something that's good, and they just end up this debate. We look at people, so I'm going to talk about, and we're going to put analysis on how such glorification happens, and we're going to talk about what kind of people actually do glorification to begin with. Yes. I'm going to talk about why when we criminalize speech to begin with, I'm going to talk about why glorification of dictatorship will actually fall into those categories. So firstly, we believe that we criminalize speech when it provides an active harm to society. We believe that when it actually harms an individual, which I'm going to talk about the victims as well. But however, we believe that also some forms, or when those speeches actually perpetuate certain norms or some social values, or actually negate some social values we actually take as granted, right? I'm going to tell you, or my second speaker, we're going to go on and talking about why those perpetuations or providing platforms of making they're talking about the debates of some norms that we believe is a sanctity or something that we should never debate about becomes a debate and why that is a social harm. So before I go into anything, I want to talk about how glorification happens in the first place.
Yes, before that.
Yes.
Are you, following your logic, are you also going to ban political parties who support these former dictators?
We believe that we believe that political parties who believe that there is something debatable, or say we believe that for example, let's say that or somebody who tries to justify discriminating human rights or negating human rights for economic development should always be actively condemned by the government. We believe that kind of logical stand is firm within our government side. Firstly, glorification always entitles justification, right? In order for someone to say this is a well-done job or absolute truth which is not debatable, they should actively justify certain action. But this is the first step. Firstly, this kind of happens when they actually justify discrimination of minorities for any kind of other social values, or secondly, oppression of the masses, or oppression of democracy, or oppression of constitutional rights, even when it comes to murder and use of violence, to get something that democracy or that dictatorship wants, right? We believe that the glorification, the first step of glorification, it always entitles justification. Not only that, they try to say that it's something that's not debatable. It's just the next step of glorification. They start to believe, or these people who glorify certain actions start to believe this is something that it should not be debated. When they start to glorify, say that Park Chung-hee did a good, or Mussolini did a good job, or Hitler did a good job, and this is something that other people should not debate about. They say this is an absolute truth which should not be in a sphere of debate. So first, we believe that when it comes to that, we believe that firstly, constitution or legal procedure or the concept of democracy that actually which is a very fabric within our society, right? We believe that the justification of human right should be there should be no excuses or no exclude or there should be no questions. What am I saying? No. We believe that when it comes to that, there should be no excuses for us to actually go on and actively, ban human rights, right? There should be no excuses for saying, oh, human rights can be violated in this ways. There should be no exclusions of those certain rights, which is a very fabric within our society. we're not talking about glorification happens in the home, right? When you talk about glorification or glorification that happens within the public, it's the only reason how we can actually see those kind of glorification happening, right? So first, we believe that these individuals who believe the basic value of human rights is something that can be excluded or something that can be violated is not something that we count as a logical debate, right? So we believe, for example, Donald Trump saying that discriminating Mexicans is good, or something that blacks should always discriminate is something that we don't think that is something that should be debated or talked within a logical spirit within this debate. And secondly, when there are a person who does not even say that it's debatable, but these are individuals who believe this is an absolute truth, which should never be actually asked, right? We believe it is really, really hard to actually bring them into spirit, even bring them into spirit of debate, right? So they will actually talk about how there should be an active debate going on, right? However, we with these glorified people who start to glorify things and say there should be no questions asked because we glorify these individuals and say this is something that's absolute truth and there should be no question asked. It's really, really hard to bring them into a healthy debating spirit, right? Because there's some people who believe this should be never debated, right? So even if they have bring a case that says this is something that's up to debate, firstly we negate the idea, saying whether or not there should be humanitarian violation can be excused, should never be in the spirit of debate because that should be never, this is something that never should be debated about and there should be no exclusions. And secondly, even if they want to try and bring this into a spirit of debate, these are individuals who even believe that debating all these issues is not even true. So they should actually bring you two cases. Firstly, why should human rights or violating human rights is something that is up to debate? And secondly, they should prove to you why those bigots, those people who provide active bigotry to the case where they glorify humanitarian discrimination or murders in order to get what they want. How are those bigots who actually think that it's not even debatable will actually enter this political arena and debate about this in the first place in a healthy platform, right? So we believe that those kind of things can never happen. That's why there should be an active condemnation about humanitarian violation done by dictatorships. Yes.
Correct. And previous to open the case of the opposition side, leader of the opposition.
Is this someone's pen?
Yes, it's my pen, but you can leave it there for now.
When you don't like something, you don't throw the supporters of that something in jail. You explain why you dislike it, Mr. Speaker. Same goes for dictators. We think that it's cowardly for inside government to simply fear the rise of Hitler again, to fear the rise of dictators, when in fact if you go beyond facts, when you go beyond debatable facts, Mr. Speaker, it is already going to be cleansed out by society to begin with. That is the exact logic that we're going to argue for you on side opposition in today's debate. But first of all, what do we propose on opposition? We propose a model of cooperation and reconciliation rather than shutting individuals out and throwing them into jail and criminalizing their opinions. First of all, as a government, we're going to make sure that all opinions are included in the discussion, whether they be radical or liberal or whatnot. But second of all, if necessary, if reconciliation is necessary to the extent that people simply cannot cooperate, we are willing to create commissions that resemble the Truth and Reconciliation Commission that was created in South Africa right after the apartheid happened. We're going to explain furthermore in my speech why that's actually an effective model to begin with. But before I get into my constructive arguments, let's first move on into a few rebuttal points against side governments. The first thing the Prime Minister told us is that glorification is something that never makes an issue debatable. First of all, Mr. Speaker, we simply deny that characterization. We think that glorification can simply mean saying that that person's actions or saying that that person's policies was actually a good thing and benefited the nation. But second of all, and more importantly, if it does indeed go beyond facts, if it goes to the extent that people say that Hitler saved the world, for example, it is ever more likely that people are going to filter out those opinions naturally according to the free marketplace of ideas, Mr. Speaker. But then towards their first argument about why we should criminalize it to begin with, they first of all told you that it's an act of social harm. We're going to further explain in our second argument why it's completely speculative to begin with. But second of all, when they talk about whenever you negate social values, we as a government should persecute individuals, no thank you. First of all, the very example of Donald Trump that they provide contradicts this idea. Because if people are racist, if people are homophobic, we don't necessarily persecute them. We try to persuade them as a society as to why their opinions are wrong. So just because they portray unfavorable social values does not necessarily mean that we automatically, as a government, have the justification to actually shut them down and criminalize them to jail. No thank you. So having said that, let's move on to our first argument, in which we're going to integrate furthermore of our responses against their constructive speech. First of all, why does a criminalization of glorification does not provide effective discussion to begin with? We're going to explain to you why reconciliation is a much needed model. We think that the model that we should base recuperation on is the idea of cooperation, not necessarily the discrimination of certain opinions. Because what do we do by isolating and alienating these opinions of glorifying dictators? We first of all ignore the entire spectrum of opinions. And what this means is that in that society, the necessity of the truth, the necessity of revealing the facts is ultimately diminished because there's no one to actually oppose it. There's no one to deny the facts, Mr. Speaker, because there's no one to ultimately be involved in the process of dissent. And we think that dissent is critical to triggering that discourse in the first place. But secondly, and we think of more harmfully, is this idea of underground discussion and the harms that that causes. Because it becomes much more easier for these people who glorify dictators to build support around their idea and rally support for their movements, even if it's a highly glorified perspective that simply does not make sense. Because once the government starts persecuting these individuals, they now have the legitimacy to tell other people that the state is being manipulative, that the state is oppressing our opinions just like the previous dictator, or even more than the previous dictator, Mr. Speaker. It becomes ever more easier for them to manipulate these opinions and manipulate what the state is doing in order to transform them into a way to rally support for their own movements. So given these various harms, we tell you on side opposition that the reconciliation of two or more parties is extremely necessary for future political development, which we think should be the prioritized agenda in today's space. We need to be able to incorporate all actors into the discussion instead of denying the obvious, Mr. Speaker. So what does reconciliation do? We think that this first of all reveals the much needed truth in society, especially when these people are incorporated into discourse. We think that people will find the necessity to provide reasons as to why that glorification is false, if it is false in the first place. We give you the example of Joseph Kony, in which he committed extreme war crimes, but at the same time wasn't tried at the International Court of Justice until individuals actually rose up against him, and until a group of people, a group of radical people, actually glorified his actions, and another group of people actually went against that and refuted the reason why Joseph Kony actually did commit these humanitarian crimes. It's especially important for the government to, through these ways of recuperation, form things like accountability, because now once they refute that the previous dictatorship regime was actually a bad regime that committed, for example, humanitarian rights violations, they now have the justification to form accountability based on their own government that they now shouldn't have to commit these human rights violations anymore. But second of all, we also believe that under the model of discussion and reconciliation, extreme parties are more likely to be crowded out. Imagine the case of North Korea. If the dictatorship, for example, were to be destroyed, there will definitely still be hardcore believers, but at the same time, other people will only show tangential interest in their previous dictator, right? In these cases, by allowing them to be incorporated into the field of discussion, it becomes much easier for us as a government to incorporate them and actually persuade them that the previous dictator was wrong and that they shouldn't be glorified. And so for these reasons, we think that the criminalization of this glorification simply doesn't provide room for effective discussion. Before I move on, yes?
What's the value of the opinion that committing genocide is a good thing?
That opinion in and of itself has no value to society, but we rather believe that by having that opinion, it allows other people and gives other people the reason to provide more valuable opinions, as highlighting the reason why if the dictator did commit genocide, why that action was wrong to begin with. Moving on to our second argument, why there is no legitimacy in criminalization. Mr. Speaker, we think that the freedom of expression can only be criminalized when there is a clear, imminent, and tangible danger that is foreseeable. And the main point here is that until something is transformed into tangible chaos and action, we as a government have no legitimacy to criminalize it. And in this case, we think that it's extremely speculative. There's nothing harmful, especially when there are natural checks and balances that are present. Because if dictators truly deserve the criticism because of the heinous actions they've committed, we think that the media and people will jump to their feet to actually provide a counter-narrative to the glorification that is going on. But most importantly, we think that by implementing side government's policy, it delegates too much power to the state and to the government. It becomes much easier for government to abuse this policy, especially because the criteria as to what things we can or cannot deem as glorification is extremely subjective. This can also be seen as a political move, especially given the fact that side government concedes to the POI that even political parties aligned with dictators dictators are going to be banned to begin with. We think that it's much easier for governments, especially newly budding governments, right after a dictatorship regime has been broken down, that now, what if the current government is committing a certain mistake and people don't like that? What if that's the reason why they want to glorify the past dictators and, for example, the oppressive economic policies that they implemented? We think that oftentimes they can be used as a tool to criticize the current regime, and that is simply stifling discussion, and even more than that, stifling the freedom of expression. Thank you.
Here, here.
Previous and recognized the MC Prime Minister.
The entire opposition case relies on one premise, that everyone is logical and everyone will listen to reason. We tell you from the very get-go that this is not the case, that there are bigots around who, no matter what they are told, who no matter all the logical evidence that goes against them, still believe that there was no Holocaust, still believe that black people should be slaves, and still believe that they are somehow sons of God or whatnot. We think that these people, the premise that all people are logical, is something that we want to tackle in this debate from the very get-go, right? So we all agree that dictatorships are bad, and from our POI, we told you that there was no actual logical validity or any value in saying something like black people should be slaves or that dictators are a good thing, right? Because we tell you that glorification is not just about something it's not just about saying he did one thing good. It's about saying that he as a general was something harm benefit analysis. He was a benefit to our society, which we all agree is not true. We tell you that dictatorship, the society under dictatorship in and of itself, by definition, was an oppressive one, because if it had the majority of the people, voting for it, it's not a dictatorship. We tell you that there was public discontent, there was oppression, there was killing, and bloodshed all around. We tell you that when some people are the ones, or there are some people in society that promote the idea that this guy was doing something that was necessary, that this guy was a good guy in general. We believe that that is an outrageous opinion, something that causes actual, tangible party harm, third-party harm to the rest of society, which we're going to prove, right? They conceded to the idea that if freedom of speech were to be something that is impeded, there needs to be tangible proof. We already told you from the, Prime Minister, but I'm going to say it again, right?
Sure.
Furthering on, our case is this. We already told you that in the status quo, why is Trump, is seen as a problem? Because he provides a rallying point. He provides legitimacy and he empowers the bigots of the world. What we're telling you is this. Right now, before the glorification of dictators, everyone thought dictators were bad. That was an agreed upon, rule. However, as time passes, people who are unsatisfied with their status quo, people who are unsatisfied with the way of living, now tend to glorify the past in any way possible, so that they feel something, they feel empowered and whatnot. That's what happened to the people who in I don't know, like Alabama, who thinks discriminating blacks and enslaving them is the way to make America great again. We tell you that all the logical evidence points to the fact that human rights is something that is human rights is an important aspect of our society, that blacks are not in fact born inferior. We have all the logical evidence to tell them that. However, the fact of the matter is this: we still have people in Alabama, still have bigots in Texas who believe that they're just born to be slaves. We tell you that the logical evidence, no matter how much you put it against them, will not work towards them. Because the underlying premise of proving the marketplace of idea is that when you ridicule these people and you give them evidence that Holocaust actually existed, they actually listen. No, but we still have people, the shade neo-Nazis in Germany who already have been told from the very school years, from the day they were born, that Hitler was a bad guy. Still, we have them believing that Hitler is an awesome guy, that Hitler should be come again, for the world to be heavenly. We tell you that no one, some people simply do not listen to logic. Now, why is this a bad thing? Impact analysis here, right? We tell you that for any political movement to gain, any legitimacy or power, we tell you that political capital is needed. What kind of political capital are we talking about? I told you, empowerment, rallying point. When these people, when there was no one in the public sphere that told these people that black people are bad, when there was no one in the public sphere that told, that Hitler was a great guy, we told you that they feel isolated, they feel disempowered, they feel that maybe, even though I believe it, it's a personal opinion, and that's how they believe it, right? They don't feel that the rest of society agrees with them. They don't feel the, brave, the audacity to put it out on an internet site, right? Well, what we're telling you is that when someone like Trump, when someone with a degree in history tells them that the historical evaluation of Hitler should be done differently, when someone with fake authority or someone who goes to the public sphere and tells them that their idea is actually a good guy, then that's when political capital of these people start to accumulate. That's when people of these bigots start to think that their idea is actually something that they can put out, and that's when political rally, when they start voting for the people who will go back to those times. What we're telling you is this. So when the political capital is gathered, we tell you that there's going to be a problem for humanitarian reasons. We tell you that because of these reasons, because that the humanitarian crisis is something that is vital in the case in this scenario, in the status quo, we tell you that these people, these bigots exist, and when we don't want them to start rallying and get a political movement, we tell you that that's what we want. We want these people to feel that they are wrong. At least in the status quo, we want society as a general to tell them that you are wrong. And you should not think this way. Even if they don't, we want general society to tell them that this is wrong. We tell you that this only happens when this is not viewed as a valid opinion, when we don't try to attack them logically, because logic will never work on them. We tell you that the only way to do it is for the government to issue these laws. We think that this is the only way to do it, and that's why it's justified, right?
Before we move on.
Yes.
So if you criminalize these groups, like if you send them to jail, in jail, are they going to think that all the ideas that they used to have was
I'm
wrong?
sorry,
Or
but
if they
if
have
the people,
100%?
like serial murderers, will gather in jail and think that murdering is good. We don't care about that.
Sure.
We tell you that when the state, tells them that this is a bad thing and sends them to jail for it, this is the state and the rest of society telling you that this is just a wrong thing to do. We can't just, tell them, we can't that's true. When the state tells you that this is a wrong thing, that can only happen when it is not up to your discretion, your opinion, and whatnot. We tell you that this is the further impact analysis is this: when things go bad, people start go to fascism. When things start turning bad economically and whatnot, that's when people start to look for a greater power to lead them on. That's what happened after World War I in Germany. That's what happened in Italy and whatnot. When things turn south, people look for power to lead them. That's human nature. We tell you that the problem of this is this: when this academic journals start publishing this, we tell you that this gives them a legitimacy that no other entity, just me posting a Facebook post about it, does not give it, right? We tell you that this kind of ideas being in this public sphere gives the next generation the ability and the legitimacy to cherry pick these ideas into saying that this was actually a prominent idea in the time. We tell you that that's what happens in the Bible. One line says that gays should be stoned to death, and everyone seems to think that that is legitimacy, that is justification for the others to persecute the gays, even though the entirety of the Bible and the rest of the Bible tells them that love is something that love thy neighbor. But people have a tendency to cherry pick lines that they only want to see, selective retention, and that is why this kind of free market of ideas that you want to have is never going to happen with these people. Very proud to propose.
Right, thank you. This would invite the deputy leader of the opposition.
Oh, it's mine, okay. Ladies and gentlemen, is it just me or the previous speaker failed to respond to everything which my first speaker talked to you about? But let me address his point by talking about three important questions to which I will be integrating my rebuttals as well as my arguments. The first question is, why do they really curb or stifle freedom of expression? Because they only said, well, there has to be an active harm, without even justifying to us why it's the appropriate standard. But the second question, which I want to do, is to answer the question, where do you better protect minorities? And the last one is a question of why is it important to accommodate the supporters of the former dictator that is glorify the previous dictatorship. On to the first question. When do we really curb or stifle freedom of expression? Affirmative said, if there exists an active harm. Contrary to what negative leader of opposition said, it's not true. Because, could you tell me exactly what jurisprudence formed that standards to the curtailment of of freedom of expression? In the Brandenburg Standard, ladies and gentlemen, you have the clear and present danger as the most appropriate standard, ladies and gentlemen, which is even supported in international law, just like the Carlin Doctrine, which means that the threat must be imminent and currently existing before any form of curtailment by the state must actually be done to that particular speech. And we do think that this is the most important standard because we have to have a high standard, largely because this is the best form of defense that an individual has against the state. Have you forgotten that the state is the most efficient murdering machine that we have in the history of mankind? Have you forgotten the fact that the state can always stifle the opposition movement, ladies and gentlemen? We do think that the same thing may actually happen, may actually be done by the ruling party, ladies and gentlemen, if you curtail the freedom of expression of these individuals. They can simply say and shut you up that, hey, you are over-glorifying or you're glorifying the Marcos regime or whatever dictator that we had, therefore we're actually going to send you to jail, even if that person can actually be the next president of the particular country, even if that person actually has a lot of ideals which can actually bring the country to further development, ladies and gentlemen. That is a threat. That's the reason why we do think that the most important standard should still be a clear and present danger. We say that the only thing that is said is that it has to be an active harm. But what do you mean exactly by an active harm? The benefits or the harms that you're talking about are largely speculative. If I say, like things in support of Marcos, for example, because I'm glorifying it, it doesn't necessarily mean, ladies and gentlemen, that there will be a harm, a tangible harm to a particular individual. We don't see these harms actually being so overwhelming to the point that the person has to be thrown behind jails. They have to actually defend the idea of criminalization, because criminalization means that you have to take away the right, liberty of the person, the capacity of the person to go around, the capacity of the person to actually have a family. All of these things will be deprived of an individual just because he said nasty things against the, in support of the former regime. We do think that that's the most appropriate punishment against these individuals. On to the second issue. Where do you really better protect the minorities? Affirmative said, the best way to actually protect minorities is to shut people up who actually, oppress them by criminalizing any form of discussion which glorifies the dictator. We say that's not true, because in fact, the only thing they're going to do is that they're making it seem so suspicious that the state is hiding something from everyone. So it actually provides more power to the rhetoric that they have. That in fact, people may think, oh, maybe the state really is hiding something, so I have to listen to whatever they're going to say, ladies and gentlemen. It's probably, what they're saying is actually probably true. The problem with this is that you're actually shoving the entire discussion under the rug in a situation where the state cannot actually check or counter-check whatever statements the radical, party is actually saying towards a particular individual. And that's actually more dangerous. That's the reason why we say that the better response is not to criminalize the discussion, but to open this discussion even more, where you do not push the discussion underground, because it's easier and more dangerous if you do so, since it's easier to convince the impressionable moderates, ladies and gentlemen. It's easier for you to manipulate them because no one is going to activate it. And for example, in the Philippines, when a lot of Marcos revisionists, ladies and gentlemen, pontificated about how important, how Marcos' regime was actually the most effective president, we had reactivated or inactivated academics to come out in the open, ladies and gentlemen, to actually speak up against it. So even if, for example, there is a credible speaker who is supporting the former regime, we see there are other credible individuals as well who are going to speak up against that particular regime to actually counter-check. And secondly, we also think that if your problem is having a credible person speaking for the government, then the best thing for you to do is to have a Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which will make sure that the truth is actually investigating upon. The solution, therefore, is not to shun these kinds of discussions more, ladies and gentlemen, at the end of the day. And first speaker also talked to you about that when the radical group actually supported Kony, there's more discussion and more people actually lobbied against it in social media, lobbied against Kony. That's the kind of discussion that we have, ladies and gentlemen. That's the kind of rallying point that we need in order to shun these kinds of lies that these people are saying. Lastly, you also have to look at the fact that the KKK was actually never really banned. Neo-Nazis are actually allowed up until now in Europe. The reason for this is because it's more dangerous if they're actually underground. But second response against them, why we think it's better not to criminalize it to protect minorities, is largely because free speech is the best defense that these minorities have. If they ban or criminalize a certain speech in order to protect minorities, like what happened in Seokwoo, Illinois, for example, where white supremacists were actually allowed to rally inside the Jewish settlement inside the United States. That case was actually used in order to justify LGBT marches, ladies and gentlemen. So we do think that the case that we're creating is a jurisprudence which will definitely harm the minorities more. On to the last argument, but before that, yes.
Basically, you believe that why violation of human rights is bad is something that people have to actively prove to other people.
Huh? What? Yeah, what? Violations? What? Why is that a standard for you to actually curb an entire freedom of expression? You can't say that somebody is being violated, ladies and gentlemen, but you don't necessarily have to send the person in jail. Third issue, why is it important to accommodate the supporters? Simple, because supporters of past dictators are the most effective watchdogs of the ruling party, right? Because they're most critical because of the sentiment of inherent historical injustice that they actually had. For example, in Rwanda, Paul Kagame, who was the leader of after the Tutsi and Hutus genocide, was actually having initially like a decent government, but eventually his government is actually descending to a state of anarchy because of his vindictive nature's measures against the former ruling party, right? So what you need therefore is a stronger opposition party against the possibility of the ruling party becoming a similar dictator, ladies and gentlemen. That's the reason why even in South Africa, after the apartheid, what they did was to never really criminalize any discussion for apartheid. You even have the Rhodes statue in the university there, but instead what you had was more discussion and the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. That's the way to go, that's the reason, that's the way by which you can stifle any form of glorification for dictatorship. Having said all those things, I think affirmative defense is completely crushed. Thank you very much.
Right, thank the previous, recognize the government with speaker.
Mr. Speaker, I like the idea of a marketplace of ideas. But then again, we don't allow poisonous food to be put on the market, right? The government regulates so that those poisonous food never reach their customers. We generally think that the marketplace of ideas in and of itself is not an infallible principle, and we don't think that it's fair, nor is it right to apply that principle to today's space for numerous reasons. Because generally the consistent stance which they never really engage upon is, we don't want to give these bigotries the belief that their opinion is a valid opinion. We think that the society needs to be forced to think that these ideas can never ever be valid to the extent that they can never be said, that they can never be accepted as a valid, debatable opinion. We think that sending that message is has such a good positive effect that it's worth criminalizing those people who are willing to glorify dictators. And for all those reasons, we'd be very proud to propose. Now, before I move on to the two questions I probably displayed, first of all, what does it mean by freedom of rights? And secondly, the harms that those glorification of dictatorship brings to society. I want to first look at what the opposition proposed, right? Because generally, I think that they are also against the idea of dictators ruling our nation, right? I think we have a general consensus that dictatorship and the values that dictators pursue are wrong. But then again, the question was, or to the extent that we want to be a society that thinks that dictatorship is bad, what is the best way to prove it? And secondly, their seemingly assertion that freedom of speech is an inassailable thing that can only be justified if there's a concrete, tangible, and physical harm. But then again, we're on team on government, we're happy to ban speeches that actively promote racism, even if that person never actively performs racism upon other people. Because we think that perpetuation of certain ideas that are contrary to the foundation of a democratic and liberal society is there's worth in banning those ideas because we don't think that it adds any credible or value to the discussion at the table, right?
Sure.
So that leads on to our first clash. What do you mean by freedom of speech? When the leader of opposition came up to the podium and told you that there needs to be a spectrum of ideas, I think that the premise was those spectrum ideas that if we have wide spectrum ideas, there must be worthwhile opinions on far end of the spectrum, right? But we see that the ideas presented by people who glorify dictators are beyond the spectrum of valid ideas, right? Because the characteristics of dictatorship that I think we all agree upon is that they completely ignore human rights. They completely think that democracy is something that can be justified, trampling upon democracy can be justified for whatever reason that they think is good. We generally live in a society where we think it's bad, and we don't think that that is something that's up to discussion. Then to the extent of convincing the majority that this is a bad thing. We think that criminalization has very good positive effect because it condemns that act, that act is bad, end of discussion, period. To the extent that we want to spread out the message that condoning dictatorship and glorifying dictatorship and believing that a dictatorship rise up again in the near future is an idea that cannot be tolerated within a democratic society. I think that's a value that the government should be able to pursue. Why? Because that's like, to the extent that's an obvious idea. But then again, their entire response was predicated upon the idea that the marketplace of ideas will suddenly function. And then these people with bigotry ideas will be persuaded to view otherwise. But Mr. Speaker, I'm telling you that those who believe that dictatorships should rule our land again that in and of itself, I don't think an intellectually a debatable and rational person can ever reach that conclusion through logic, right? I think logic proves to us that dictatorship is bad, but then again, if they're able to come up with the random reasons to believe that it's good, we don't think that's beyond the scope of debate. That's about rhetoric, right? When Donald Trump says that all Muslims are racist, and we see that 30% of Americans think that's an okay thing to say in the world, we think that there's generally a problem, right? Because we see Donald Trump doesn't really engage with the debate. He goes out with those inflammatory and biased and racial and discriminatory comments, and he gets away with it. We see that once general public thinks that is okay, that is a great harm. Why? Because in the status quo, in our house, when there are people who start to voice our opinion saying that, oh, dictatorship is good, we have an active society pressure that idea is wrong. But then again, under their side of the house, it's under the premise that idea can be valid and that idea can be made. It gets away with the humility of the argument, saying that it's perfectly okay for me in public to say that Mexicans are racist, and this completely gets rid of all the political correctness or any consideration of that matter, right? We think that is something that simply hampers upon freedom of speech, because I think freedom of speech really applies to ideas that are valid, that are worth discussing. That's clearly not debate worth discussing, right? Because we don't have motions in debate such as whether babies are parasites in a mother's womb, because we think that the idea of equating a mother with a parasite is a bad thing to debate about. It's not educational. We think that standard should apply to the society as well. Then again, secondly, no. Basically, we told you when they said that, well, if we are not able to convince these people, because we generally think that these people are really, really hard to convince, just because you approach them and say, oh, that's okay, we won't think that they'll be convinced at all. In that case, we're happy to put them in jail, or we're happy to put them underground. They said that putting them underground is bad. Without proving to you why pushing them underground is bad, because at least we don't have that idea perpetuated throughout society. We see that why do people glorify dictators? That's the question I had when I was preparing this debate. But then I realized that even among dictatorships, not all people are discriminated, right? Dictatorships most oppress minorities and use demagoguery to bandwagon the majorities. And we think that white German people under Hitler's regime was perfectly fine, right? But I think for those people who could have a reason to believe that under Hitler's dictatorship it would be okay, because they're not at the sort of mistake when they are given the opportunity to believe that, oh, Hitler can rise again. It's okay to believe that Hitler can rise again. We generally think that these people start to gather around, right? Because the political capital and momentum can only be occurred when there's a large enough mass up the ground to stage protests and to perpetuate the idea. We tell you that we need to cut them from the root before it becomes a bigger and bigger tree that's harder to stop. When it becomes bigger and when it becomes a valid political party, like they say, like the neo-Nazi parties, we think that's incredibly hard to shut them off with debate, because, like I said, if they were willing to engage in a rational debate in the first place, I don't think they would go to the extent that they would praise Hitler. Because praising Hitler, I think, is beyond the debate that we're doing. Then again, the last argument was, when then would the government abuse it? Ridiculous. I don't think that's backed up by any claim, because generally, I think we made a clear distinction. If you're making an idea that's so opposed to concepts that are fundamental to society, such as human rights or democracy, we're happy to put you in jail, we're happy to restrict that thing. I think it's clearly a standard, and that possibly cannot be used to oppress the minority for making a valid opinion. I think the distinction is clear, that's perfectly okay, and like abuse can happen with any laws. I don't think that in and of itself is a reason to not go with the policy. Very proud to propose.
Granting the previous, and I invite the opposition with
Mr. Speaker, just because on this right podium I say that woman is bad, or woman is inferior than man, or women should never take positions that men should take, it doesn't mean that my ideas should be the justification to criminalize and I sent to jail. We think the idea that transforming from the opposition team is too much simplistic, trying to claim that these ideas, that just because it goes against the social values that we cherish, just because it goes against the norms that we want to value, we have to punish them. We think that idea itself, there cannot be the justification to why we should criminalize these groups of individuals, or even why it's effective for us to withdraw out such kind of wrongful ideas that they claim. So, Mr. Speaker, this debate lies on two major issues. Firstly, what is the most effective measure to reconcile those kind of extreme ideas and to have a general discourse? And secondly, what is the principal justification behind criminalization, whether it's justified for us to criminalize? So on the first issue first, the effectiveness. They've claimed that criminalization will lead them to fix their thoughts. It will send a strong social message. I have three responses. Firstly, Mr. Speaker, we think that criminalization do not in itself fix the ideas. When I asked in the POI that just because you send them to jail, it doesn't mean that they will suddenly feel like shameful about their ideas and feel that they need to fix their ideas. But we think we would rather, it's more like believable for them to raise resentment. Then the response is that we don't care what they discuss in jail. Mr. Speaker, that's not true. It matters because these individuals will, at the end of the day, return back to the society. The individuals who has been sent to jail, if they have more resentment rather than fixing their thoughts, we think it will be much more dangerous, and the scenarios that they are drawing would more likely to occur. But second of all, we think that the social message that we're sending is no good, but it's just sending that we're facing more oppressive government who's trying to curtail all freedom of expressions just because of the speculative harms that we're not even sure whether it's going to exist. And we think that it's giving too much power to the state, and no matter what the truth is, we think that perception that individual society, perception that the society will formulate is an oppressive government who's trying to restrict freedom of expressions just because it goes against, presumably it goes against the social norms. And third of all, we think that it would cause much more bigger harm because it would rather cause more resentment, and we think that it will lead to underground discussion, which will mean that it will be more dangerous. We think underground discussion is bad in three ways. First of all, we think it will push them more extreme. They're gaining more legitimacy against the current government, to have the impressive idea against current governments. And we think they're totally excluding the ideas of moderate groups within those kind of groups that glorifies these kind of glorifying like past dictators. We think that they're having an exclusive discussion only about extreme groups of people within the same ideas, and we're in fact even pushing the more moderate groups of people into those extreme sides. Why more resentment is bad? Because it creates more incentive for them to transform it into an action. The ideas that they now has the legitimacy to be moved into an action. But more than that, in the most least harmful scenario, the discussion doesn't dissolve, which means that the idea that they claim to be harmful doesn't disappear. We think that's why, which is the goal of the government, it actually fails. That's why even in most least harmful scenario, because underground discussion will still exist, they fail to prove why it's effective. Then we gave you a mechanism about our policy, having formulating a truth reconciliation commission, investigating facts and representing people from all groups of people, including those radical groups. Very unresponsive, but briefly summarize what we have told you. We told you mainly four things. Firstly, we told you how the necessity of truth remains. Now people can evaluate based on the truth that we have investigated. We also told you that truth reconciliation is better than simply cutting discussion because it will never result in any reconciliation. But further, we also have extended further through our second speaker of the opposition that it will lead to better democracy because it becomes a strong opposing party working as a watchdog. No engagement from the opposition team. We also told you that underground discussion is much more dangerous, and that's what we think that our policy works better in a way, minimizing the harms and solving the problems. Then they say, in this whip speech, suddenly they say, we don't want it to be heard as valid. We have three responses. Firstly, if your description of those ideas are so extreme, like human rights violation was so awesome, like Hitler was good, or blacks should be slaves, who on earth would will treat those kind of facts as valid points. We think in itself is actually, we think that's bad. And just because government tolerating those kind of ideas to exist in our society, it do not mean that government agrees with such ideas. But second of all, existence of those ideas do not mean that they will convince others to believe the same. And even if that's the case, it may be the result of because the current regime is so terrible. And we think that, like for example, in economic policies, like these glorification may occur, like the economic policies of past dictators was much better. So it's kind of valid ideas can be actually portrayed as, it doesn't mean that these individuals will convince those kind of extreme ideas to the platform. But thirdly, Mr. Speaker, we think that it's rather be portraying these groups of people as oppressive government, which will have more negative impact. That's why in terms of effectiveness, we think having a truth reconciliation, inviting more discussion is far more better for the society. But second of all, even if in second issue, whether it's justified. Firstly, they say that because it has harms. Well, we have three responses. Firstly, we think that they have never proven to us with specific examples of what kind of harms that the idea itself is going to cause to our society. But second of all, we think that the harms that they are presenting is in fact a speculative harm, and we cannot violate freedom of expression based on speculative harm that may or may not exist. But third of all, even if that's the case, we think that idea itself doesn't mean that it causes harms. Only when such idea transforms into an harmful action, then is the time we have to punish. That's why we have given to you our criteria, where only when we observe clear, imminent, tangible danger, then we curtail freedom of expression. No response coming from the opposition. Then they claim that it's not debatable, they already have concluded themselves. Well, Mr. Speaker, firstly, they're only considering exclusively about extreme groups, but more than that, we think that criminalization do not fix their conclusion. We think that itself cannot be justified. But third of all, we think it actually worsens it, but more than that, simply put, we think that it cannot work as a justification why we should criminalize. Just because they have concluded idea, do not mean that society should have the right to judge it false and restrict it and send them to jail. Then they say that they have no value. Mr. Speaker, that's once again do not become a justification to send them to jail. So in the more crucial discussion on the principal areas, the government team have never gave us a solid principle justification why we should criminalize these groups of people. That's why we think not only this is principally wrong, but it will not be any good to reconciliation. We are extremely proud to oppose.
Right, to close the debate. To wrap up the speeches of the opposition side, opposition reply.
Ladies and gentlemen, in both sides, there is glorification of former dictators. Because even if affirmative bench doesn't want a glorification, it will still happen, right? Because it will happen underground. You will still have radical supporters who are so convinced that a former dictator is that committed like great things or is a blessing from God, right? Because you're not attacking the mentality and the reasoning behind these people and the reason why they're supporting the former dictator, or why they actually resent the ruling party so much. It will happen, right? And you're not checking that these things are happening or whatever they're saying to the other moderates. But in a negative bench, we say that it is indeed happening, but it's out in the open, where you can attack the very mentality and get to the root of the problem, where you can understand them, you can understand resentment, and the things or the lies that they're saying. At least in our side of the house, you can correct them, ladies and gentlemen, and you can even understand them more in order for you to come up with better policies and how to engage these individuals. In their side of the house, they don't have that particular benefit. But the second reason why they actually lose today's debate is because, well, we agree that glorification may be harmful, just like saying, for example, nigger or faggot, or saying that Marcos was the best president ever. We don't think it's so bad, which warrants you to be deprived of your civil liberty, as well as your rights to life and liberty, ladies and gentlemen, because you will be placed behind bars to begin with. It's not that harmful, guys, and you've never really proven to us why it's a clear and present danger to begin with. But the second thing is that if you do that, if you lower the threshold for the curtailment of curtailment for freedom of expression, you're giving the ruling party so much power, which is so dangerous, a greater danger that we have to prevent compared to the speculative harm that they're talking about in their side. So if we're going to compare dangers or harms, we do think that theirs is even greater than ours. But the last reason why they completely lose today's debate by a trashing margin is because affirmative is completely unresponsive. We talked about that there has to be a proper standard before you can actually curtail a particular right. We talked to you about extensively the clear and present danger, and they provided this, well, it has to be active harm, without even telling us essentially where in the world did that active harm come from, which kind of legal jurisprudence provided that. Ladies and gentlemen, they never even told us what that is. We told you about the idea that if you push the discussion underground, it's more harmful, that people may actually speculate and think that the government is hiding something from them. Was there any response from the whip speaker? I'm so hurt because I extensively talked about it and didn't even respond to it, ladies and gentlemen. But the third thing, which I said a while ago, is that jurisprudence and public policies which are used to defend, which are used in order to ban a particular speech, in order to defend minorities, can actually be used against them eventually because of the indivisibility of these particular rights. If it was used, for example, ladies and gentlemen, to ban the white supremacists in Seokwoo, Illinois, ladies and gentlemen, that jurisprudence can actually be used in order to ban LGBT marches, right? But the last things I talked to you about, which was never responded as well, was the entire point on that you have to engage former rulers. Because the former supporters of former dictators, because these supporters, ladies and gentlemen, should be viewed as strategic partners for reconciliation and for a better, more coherent society. This is what happened actually in the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in South Africa. Again, something which they never actually really responded to at the end of the day. But secondly, I talked to you about the idea that these people, the supporters of the former regime, can be a good check and balance for the ruling party, because ruling parties may descend into becoming dictators again in the future because of their vindictiveness, because of their taste of power, ladies and gentlemen. Something which could have happened or is happening with Paul Kagame in Rwanda, ladies and gentlemen. We do not need that to happen. But the last reason why they actually lose today's debate is that they simply had weak argumentation. They've never really proven to us how criminalization will eventually magically lead to, with a magic wand, leads to people like stopping, glorifying, like former dictatorship. We do think that these kinds of lapses and coming from a formative bench would definitely warrant that the lose in today's round. Thank you very much.
Right, in previous closes debate, got reply.
Mr. Speaker, the logic coming from the government was pretty simple. We admit that when there's somebody who says that dictatorship which justifies in killing or mass murders just because to achieve what the dictator wants is good, because without question and without debate, we believe there should be a unified social condemnation on it. We don't want that kind of voice. Should be up to an arena of debate where people talk about it and say and have to prove why that is bad. We believe that the harm that they try to tell us and to ask us why is pretty simple. When those ideas says there can be excuses for humanitarian violations, and when those voices can be certainly something that can be accepted as something that's debatable, is a clear harm that comes to our society, which we continuously told you. Those things, when they try to say those kind of things, is a voice that should be in a market of idea and that makes healthy debate. Those kind of ideas that forms because we don't criminalize it and we don't have condemnation. What's a clear harm that we say? Whether or not there can be excused humanitarian violation, it should be never debatable, Mr. Speaker. The clear harm they continuously told you from our side. They told you how bigots don't disappear. Bigots don't disappear on their side as well. However, we don't want the bigots to rally thinking that this is something that is debatable. It is something that can be accepted as justified choice. It's something they can enter a debate about. However, we also told you how they don't even enter this debate because they don't think it's debatable in the first place, right? It was clearly told from the Prime Minister. People who glorify Kim Jong-un in North Korea don't enter the debate in the first place. They don't try to enter the market of ideas even if people told you that's a clear problem. And when those bigots rally with that glorification, we clearly told you why that was a problem, worse than any kind of underground that happens in the first place. So with that said, from the beginning, they have a wrong idea of glorification, right? The glorification is not like, hey, Suarez fights people, but we think Suarez is a good player. It's never glorification, right? Glorification is not something that is not level. So people who glorify, as we told you over and over again, doesn't think that's debatable. Some people who glorify Kim Jong doesn't think that whether or not Kim Jong is good is never debatable, right? This is the problem that this is the problem that this is the whole start of this problem, right? Firstly, they told you again and again why a healthy market of idea is good. However, even if healthy market of idea is good, they should have told us from the beginning why those bigots who think that those can glorify dictators and what they dictators is something that's not debatable will enter that market of idea in the first place and be persuaded by idea was the first thing they had to prove, which is never proven which I told you from the Prime Minister. Secondly, we even told you why whether or not humanitarian violation can be justified is never something we have to actively disprove, right? People who actually come into the social fabric don't have any kind of responsibility to go on and tell you why there should be no justification for humanitarian violation. There should be only single condemnation saying humanitarian violation is always bad. And this is something that never should actually enter the arena of debate, right? Secondly, they touch you about checks and balances and say that checks and balances. They never told you why checks and balances to a former presidency should include glorification that's mass murder to only get what dictatorship want, right? Checks and balances even happens when there's no bigots saying that glorification of mass murder is possible, right? They should never always tell you why checks and balances should also include glorification of mass murder. And they even tell you who think that it's good, right? Hey, those people who actually go and rally with Donald Trump even says that, active denial of Mexican rights is good too. And they're telling you why I think that it's good. Where bigots actually come outside because they can rally about the glorification, and which is something which on the point they don't think that it's even debatable, right? So whole harm coming from the proposition is pretty much this: we don't want those ideas of violation of human rights. We don't think that should enter a debatable arena in the first place. When that actually enters and says this is something we debate about, so people have to actively prove to you why glorification of mass murder should be bad, is a bad thing. When those kind of things happen, when those active disclosure or active debate happens, it is a start of any kind of problem, right? We told you that is why that is a clear harm. We told you about any kind of individual should always believe the sanctity of human life is something that doesn't enter a debatable arena, which I continuously told you they never understand. They should also understand why they never told you why they don't even enter this debatable arena in the first place. That's why they also lose in face weight, and we're very proud of that.